Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we consider the next Battle of Britain.
It's comfortable looking back at the Battle of Britain. Right now, what's really important is looking forward. It is hard to inculcate an operational mindset within the wire and then everybody go about their regular business the rest of the time. War is a failure. That is a failure of deterrence.
Also, in this episode, we'll reheat a few stories just in case you've missed them, and we'll be finding out who is under the hat this week.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
It's two things. It is Yorkshire tea bags and Marmite.
Find out who is under the hat at the end of this episode. Now, the hope is there won't be another Battle of Britain. However, should the unthinkable happen, what has changed since the last battle? How might an integrated air and missile defence system help? And how could changing the way we think prepare us for such a conflict? I spoke with Dr Sophy Antrobus, Research Fellow and Co-Director of the Freeman Air and Space Institute, to hear an academic's point of view. Dr Sophy Antrobus, welcome to Inside Air.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Now, it's really, really cool. I'm really excited. We met at an event at RUSI, Royal United Services Institute, and I've invited you to talk about the next Battle of Britain. Before we get into that, just want to clarify for our listeners from the outset that the views that we're going to be, or the views that you'll be sharing are not necessarily the views of the RAF or the Ministry of Defence, but really your own analysis of what the future could hold. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. Really, really happy to be here. I'm hoping there won't be a next Battle of Britain, of course, but I think if we don't talk about it, we won't help the situation either. And I should say, as a research fellow at the Freeman Air and Space Institute, I'm also speaking independently of King's College London and my institute. So what I say is they're my views, not those of that institution either.
Okay, so this is Pete and Sophie having a chat.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's really nice to have this chat with you. Let's just start. We need to ground this, and we need to know what makes you you. So could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, Peter. Of course I can. So I'm now, as I just mentioned, a research fellow at the Freeman Air and Space Institute. So I studied for my PhD over 5 years ago in air power. And actually, I was looking at the early history of the Royal Air Force, and some of what we might talk about, it's important to understand that history, I think, to an extent. So the history geek in me pops up, I'm afraid, because of that PhD. But for the last 4.5 years, I've been looking at contemporary air and space power, predominantly air power, and thinking about the real challenges of the moment. And of course, particularly since the reinvasion of Ukraine in 2022, that's really focused minds, as have other conflicts. So the world, as we all know, is a challenging place in geopolitical terms. Before that, though, it's probably relevant for me to mention that I spent 20 years in the Royal Air Force. I was a flight operations officer. I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, so I was very much that era. We might come on to the different eras, but the post-Cold War expeditionary era, as well as a tour on aircraft carriers. And my final tour was running operations, the airfield at RAF Valley in Anglesey, Innismon, as I also call it.
Oh, lovely, lovely. Okay. Oh, that was my first tour at RAF Valley.
It's a great place. I love Valley.
And which initial officer training intake were you?
Oh, I've got to say this, have I? It's the one before Rich Knighton. So I was 138. So yeah, Rich. Full disclosure, Rich Knighton and I were on University Air Squadron together. So we go back some time.
Do you know? I didn't know that. So here we go. I was 133.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but it was my first half of my career as a regular, and now
Right, so
back.
I've outed myself age-wise now.
Okay, and you're also a listener of Inside Air. Tell us which episodes you like.
Oh gosh, there's so many, but actually I got into listening to Inside Air, and I think it relates to the event we met at the Royal United Services Institute because of some work I was doing on reserves. And you've got a couple of excellent podcasts on that subject. But really, in fact, I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm really looking forward to listening to the one on the air historical branch.
Oh, it's
because
amazing.
That's
It's really
a subject
good.
close to my heart. I absolutely love. There's two Sebs now. Seb Cox has just left, taken over. Seb Ritchie as head of it, the Air Historical Branch. But I spent some time researching there for my PhD, so that's on my list. Perhaps the weekend, right when I've actually finished work.
Okay, right into the subject. We're here to talk about the next Battle of Britain. Can you tell us about previous Battle of Britons, just to put the groundwork down?
Yes, of course. So obviously we're all familiar with the famous Battle of Britain of 1940, but perhaps I should start by, given this is an RAF podcast, listened to, I know, by a lot of RAF personnel, how central this is to the history of the creation of the Royal Air Force, because it was the bombings on the mainland of the UK in the First World War which led to the creation of the Royal Air Force. 1906, when Alberto Santos Dumont first flew in European skies, Lord Northcliffe had said then that Britain was no longer an island. Essentially, what was known as the Silver Streak, the Channel, the English Channel, could be penetrated, could be overwhelmed, could be flown across. That's what he predicted, and of course that happened reasonably soon after that. And by the First World War, air power was coming of age. So as bombs started to rain down on Britain, the Prime Minister at the time, Lloyd George, decided that there should be some kind of reaction to this aerial bombardment, and he asked General Jan Smuts to write a report, a couple of reports actually, and he was appointed to what was called the Committee on Air Organisation and Home Defence Against Air Raids. And as a result of that, the Air Ministry was created and the Royal Air Force was born on the 1st of April 1918, as many of your listeners will know. So in a sense, that wasn't what we would traditionally know as the Battle of Britain, but it was the core reason why all our light blue colleagues, you and your light blue colleagues, exist today.
That's really good. So that was the First World War. That was the creation of the Royal Air Force. And okay, this isn't a history podcast, but we do dip into history if we need to for context. What happened to the Royal Air Force after the end of the First World War?
Well, the Royal Air Force, it's been viewed as a tough time for the Royal Air Force. There wasn't much money around. Demobilisation was happening. There wasn't investment ready to be made. I mean, the country was in a terrible state financially, so money wasn't there to buy lots of new aircraft. But Lord Trenchard, the Chief of the Air Staff in the 1920s, the father of the Royal Air Force, although he absolutely hated that term, I think, so maybe I shouldn't use it. He realised that what he needed to establish was different foundations. He concentrated quite a lot on building RAF Holton and RAF Cranwell, and various other signs of the RAF existing around the country. So it was a tough time, that first 1920s period. The Army and the Navy both didn't really see why the Air Force should remain independent. But after a variety of different committees and investigations and inquiries, the Air Force's future was confirmed, and that gave the Air Force the opportunity, really at quite last minute chances, to build itself up for the Second World War, for what was coming in terms of acquiring aircraft like the Spitfire, which was so central to the Battle of Britain.
Is it right to think that the British military of the day was more expeditionary in its strategy rather than defensive?
Yes, that's a very good point. So the RAF was spread around different parts of the globe at the end of the First World War, and remained in some of those places to carry on policing what was then the British Empire. in particular, and I think quite importantly for the Royal Air Force's development in the 1920s in what was originally Mesopotamia and then known as Iraq. The Royal Air Force petitioned the government to allow it to take the lead in policing, and it developed this concept of air policing, whereby it limited the number of what we now know as boots on the ground, the number of soldiers, saving a lot of money by threatening local tribespeople from the air. Now, this is anathema to us in modern terms, and there were eventually quite a lot of debates about the morality of that kind of operation, quite rightly, in my 21st century viewpoint. But at the time, it was seen as a very expeditious and cheaper way of controlling parts of the empire that were far flung from Britain. And the RAF's taking over command under Air Marshal John Salmond, I think, was a really important turning point in the strength of the RAF in arguing for its independence through the 1920s.
Yeah, so we're in this era between the First and Second World War where investment in the Royal Air Force was more into the expeditionary, it was more into the bomber force of the time because bombers would solve everything. And the fighter aircraft, it was very late to the party, wasn't it?
Well, yes, I mean,
air defence.
Several years, yes, the 1930s were critical to building up air defence capability of the Royal Air Force. And in fact, as I said earlier, I'm a fellow of the Freeman Air and Space Institute, and that's named after Wilfred Freeman. And he is hugely important in terms of procuring the Spitfire. So he is central to that. And later on, he worked in the Ministry for Aircraft Production in the war. And although he didn't get on with Lord Beaverbrook, his minister, and tried to resign 3 times, Beaverbrook wouldn't accept his resignation because he was so important, both in the build-up and then in the conduct of the Battle of Britain. So really, really important time in the history of the Air Force. And of course, sometimes I sigh as leaders, senior officers in the Air Force refer to the Battle of Britain at every opportunity. This is, the RAF's finest hour. Despite writing a history PhD, I do think one of the advantages of the Air Force in its early days was it didn't have a history and it was very future facing. I worry as the RAF has passed its 100th year and beyond that it's comfortable looking back at the Battle of Britain. Right now, what's really important is looking forward. Although we might briefly talk about 1940 if you want to a little bit further. But then, a lot of what I think we're going to talk about in the rest of this podcast is about forcing our eyes forward and ahead to the potential threats that we are looking at now.
Most people know about the Spitfire and the Hurricane, and let's talk briefly about the Battle of Britain. But can you just also tell us about the non-flying element of air defence in 1940, which is very much aligned to your former profession?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing about air defence, and we're going to probably, I think, discuss the current term that's in use, integrated air and missile defence, and how I find that potentially a little cumbersome. But partly because, as 1940 shows, air defence, air and missile defence only works if it is integrated, and it involves the people on the ground, it involves civilians, it involves the military, it involves technology. All of those things need to come together, and they just did for the Battle of Britain in terms of radar, the chain home network, the home defence forces on the ground, the people spotting aircraft. And, we see this in Ukraine today. Members of the civilian population, using their phone technology to report incursions into their airspace of drones and missiles and so on and so forth. So really, 1940 just demonstrates that there's new technology, but the concept is similar.
The principles are the same. Royal Observer Corps.
Yes. Everybody, yes. The contributions of all, both uniformed and non-uniformed, on the ground or in the air, or even and at sea, of course. Let's not forget the maritime component to that. they're all vital.
Okay, so the most people, I think everyone listening to this will understand a bit about the Battle of Britain because it's so well documented, so often talked about. Roll the clock forward, going into 1944-45, V1 and V2 weapons. Can you tell us about those weapons and how that affected the UK?
Yes, and I think the V1 and V2, if people read sort of living history or history of those who survived that period or lived through that period, you get a very visceral sense of just how scary it was to for new technology, new weapons, new missiles to be attacking you and not knowing where they'd land, who they'd kill, what they would destroy. So again, a symptom or a signal, a way of understanding that aerial bombardment is very specifically unnerving. And that's something that we need to bear in mind looking forward. I think what's interesting also about V1 and V2 was, in order to defend from their attacks, what we would now call counter-air missions, which are effectively offensive missions to try and attack the source of the missiles coming at us, was something that was developed then. So the British Royal Air Force were going the bomber force, very important, and I've known Bomber Command and Fighter Command veterans myself. I've been honoured to know many of them. They always spoke of each other more highly than of themselves because they knew how important they both were. This is integration again, right? And, the importance of the bomber force going and finding logistical sites and sources of those missiles attacks over on the continental Europe was very much part of that fight.
Yeah, and the importance of the intelligence community, the photo reconnaissance Spitfires, the raids on Peenemünde, the individuals that worked out where these V1 and V2 were coming from. The V2 was fairly indiscriminate, but it didn't have warning. How did Britain cope with not knowing that these weapons were coming in? Because the V1s, they knew they were being spotted, but the V2 wasn't.
Well, I think that points to the psychological impact of it. What it required was real resolution from the British public, civilian and military, in girding themselves against attacks that they couldn't see coming. And then the resolve of the forces, the armed forces, to do their best to repel them. But once again, as in the Gotha attacks of the First World War, that this was highly destabilizing for people who just were seeing technology they just didn't recognize at all.
So let's just recap quickly. You had the Battle of Britain, Royal Air Force victorious, and we do need to say that it wasn't just the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy were very much a part of the Battle of Britain. And it started in France, the Battle of Britain. So it's...
Yes, I mean, even the dates are much disputed because which bits do you include and which bits don't you? Historians have long debated those things, and they will forevermore, I think.
So we've got the Battle of Britain. Yeah, that's that sorted. Then the back end of the war, you could say that that's another Battle of Britain because of these V1, V2 weapons. And then there's the response post-war into the Cold War. Can you take us into that phase? So we're talking sort of post-war into the late 80s, early 90s.
Yes. I'll try and be fairly succinct because it's obviously a big period. But essentially, I mean, the key important seismic change in the world was the start of the Cold War, was the period of the Cold War where we had the sort of West ranged against the Soviet Union, the USSR, as both sides were developing missile technology. And at the same time, the space race began. A colleague of mine, Dr Blethenbowen, up at Durham, his recent book makes the argument that space warfare is nothing new. This emergence of these sort of missiles out of the technology of the end of the Second World War directly translates into the race for bigger, longer range missiles that can then deliver, if needed, nuclear weapons. And then as technology develops further or doesn't, the realization that there's no country really that could create a missile defense system sufficient to ensure that no nuclear weapon would ever get through, which led us into mutually assured destruction as a way of existing. And in 1972, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was formally codified, which meant essentially everybody realized that the threat of retaliation was so big that nobody would use nuclear weapons. That was the theory. And of course, we didn't, although there was obviously some close calls. And then, into the 80s, different priorities for different areas. The Soviet Union was starting to develop better longer range missiles that could impact or could threaten European countries. The US less bothered about that, more interested in maintaining that nuclear Cold War standoff. So there was more investigation into sort of developing theatre or regional missile systems. And then we come to the end of the 1980s and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And I'm sure we'll go on now to talk about the next phase, which took us all, both West and Russia, in very different directions.
So hopefully we've done the foundation. We're really keen to hear your view on what the next Battle of Britain will look like, and really importantly, how will we fare?
Well, I suppose I should start by saying, in talking with you now, in wanting to talk about this, in wanting to write about these sort of issues, it is so that there isn't a next Battle of Britain, so that I can be part of voices ensuring that this is discussed and taken seriously enough, that we build a sufficiently strong military country. I would call it an aura of being willing to take on this challenge alongside our allies in the West. So in a sense, I try not to imagine too much exactly what it would look like. But of course, the thing is, we can see an awful lot from what's going on both with Israel and Iran and also Ukraine and Russia. We're seeing lots of different types of missiles. Of course, Russia has now used a long-range ballistic missile with a conventional warhead in Ukraine, so that's happened. But then there's this whole mixture of short-range missiles, drones, lots of drones of all such shapes and sizes that mean that whatever the next Battle of Britain looks like, it's probably going to be a sort of large mixture of those different sorts of technologies. That said, there's also the issue that, say we get to a point where there's a decision to make some kind of act of aggression from the air. That's what we're talking about, threats from the air. There's nothing to stop a country or even a non-state actor using some kind of marine vessel, civilian vessel, to launch some kind of drone attack at our country. So the next Battle of Britain might not be this big all-out war immediately. It might be something that escalates. It might be probing. It might be things that actually it's very difficult for government to decide how to respond without escalating. And the risk of escalation getting out of control is, of course, what I think worries all of us most that are involved in defence the most.
So the Royal Air Force has provided the deterrence of fast jet interception for, gosh, I don't know when that started. Do you know when QRA, Quick Reaction Alert, started? That's put you on the spot as an academic, isn't it?
I should know the date. I don't know the exact date, but longer than I've been involved with the Air Force. And in fact, I've been doing quite a lot of research on separately on risk appetite and attitudes to taking risk in flying, in particular in the Air Force, going back right to the sort of 1960s and 70s. And, you see a Royal Air Force, a huge Royal Air Force compared to the size of it now, which was completely geared towards the the line in Germany facing the Soviet Union, and what the war plan was if war started. Everything was geared around that, and it's just amazing how culturally it was completely embedded in every service person, and in every exercise and plan. It really was quite different then.
Okay, so from a conventional warfare perspective, aircraft against aircraft, it's really important to say that the Royal Air Force today, every single day, every hour of the day, every day of the year, is ready to respond at a moment's notice to any threat or perceived threat to UK airspace.
Absolutely, they're there on the ground with the Typhoon as you say, every day, minute of the year, and of course down in the Falkland Islands as well. So it's a big task, and it's a draining task for any service, and they do an amazing job. We're very lucky, but of course, and that is a very important element of our defence from the air. But there is a limit, clearly, to what airborne fast jet aircraft can do at the moment, what technology they have. They don't, for example, have the technology to really take out ballistic missiles. So we saw that in the Iranian attacks on Israel, in the earlier attacks in, I think it was April last year, Typhoons were used to shoot down drones, which are clearly slower moving than the faster ballistic missiles. But then in the attacks that took place in early October 2024, they didn't engage, and because the threat was much more about the ballistic missiles. So they're absolutely 100% crucial to our protection, but they are one element in a much bigger picture of what's required to provide that protection.
So that's maybe the time then to really dig into what is an integrated air and missile defence system, because that's what you and I rely on to live our lives in peace.
Integrated air and missile defence, bit of a mouthful of a term. That system should provide protection if we are attacked from missiles coming at us from the air. Now, those missiles could have been launched from the air, from aircraft flying. They could be launched from the sea, from maritime vessels, military or civilian, as I've just mentioned, or they could be launched from the land, from other countries. And they might be coming in at low level as drones, or they might be coming at us from outside of the atmosphere. The system, air and missile defence, is about a whole range of activities. It's about detecting missiles, so seeing them coming before they get to us. We mentioned earlier about the V2 and not being able to see them coming. If we can see things coming, we want to be able to identify them. What are they? Now, that's complicated, not least because if we talk about current potential threats, Russia is very fixated on dual-use missiles, so missiles that can carry both conventional and nuclear warheads. So even if you can identify a missile, you might not know what it's carrying. You need to assess what's going on, and fast. The faster, the better. Have ways of intercepting it, and in some areas we're in the UK relatively limited in the number of assets we've got to do that, and that can do that, and engage them and essentially destroy them. So the system, and then the passive part of the system, when we're talking about it, is the bit that also does camouflage, concealment, dispersal. You'll have talked in previous podcasts about agile combat employment. That'll be a term that the Royal Air Force personnel will be very familiar with. That need to move things around to land Typhoons on motorways is probably the most obvious image that you could potentially create. Those are all parts of passive defence. They're about not getting found and attacked, and the Ukrainians have been amazing at this. Right from day one, their aircraft were taking off from one airfield and landing at another, so that the Russians were having a hard time keeping up with what they were doing. And of course, it applies to facilities that aren't military as well. You defending those, concealing those, camouflaging those.
And the way things are today, compared to 1940, the equivalent of home chain is not just on British soil, is it? If we think about Scandinavia and the early warning systems, the cooperation across NATO.
No, absolutely. The core of our current air defence it is utterly interrelated with our allies, and particularly with NATO allies, and that system is hugely important. Clearly, we can peel off elements of our own defence. For example, if the Typhoon is called on QRA because there's a civilian airliner that's encroaching in our airspace, as happens from time to time, normally not for bad reason, of various reasons, normally mistakes or problems. So we can recall our assets to do that kind of job, but we're committed to the NATO air defence system. We talked about periods, though, the post-Cold War period, and we've sort of led up to where we are now. But clearly NATO, what they did for some time, they had other priorities, really, than integrated air and missile defence. In the early 2000s, they were enlarging the number of countries that were members of NATO, and very much entangled in some of the expeditionary operations that those of us who were serving in the Air Force at the time remember well. So it has been only really since 2010 when there was a real commitment back into to committing to rebuilding air and missile defence that NATO's realised and has committed to taking that as a very serious part of the defence and deterrence role of NATO.
So air and missile defence, we kind of get that because we're familiar with that. But the piece of the jigsaw we're not so familiar with and just becoming aware of and really perhaps feeling more concerned about is the threat of drones either launched offshore, they're launched from another country, or they're launched within the UK, whether that's a single drone or 1,000 drones. How does this integrated air and missile defence cope with this emerging huge threat?
Well, with difficulty, I suppose, is the rather depressing answer. I mean, it's interesting. We've seen some very effective handling of those kind of attacks by Israel, but Israel is, of course, as a small country, it's mainly dealing with shorter range issues, and it's got relatively smaller populated areas that are in a small area geographically in itself. It's not like trying to defend the whole of Poland, the whole of Ukraine, clearly, which is enormous, but even our country is significantly different geographically. So we've seen that drones can be dealt with reasonably effectively. What's clearly on the minds both of the Royal Air Force and our adversaries is how to use drones in en masse to make it much more difficult to bring them all down. But also, if lots of them are decoys and you don't know which ones are the ones you really need to hit because some of them are just carrying a dumb payload or they're just simply a flying lump of something, metal, whatever, then you can, in a sense, attempt to saturate the defences of the person of the country that you're trying to attack. So there's all sorts of threats posed by drones. But then we must remember that in Ukraine, this mass use of drones on both sides and the escalation in technology that's happening, there's the cycle of every 6 to 8 weeks, people developing countermeasures to the newest drones and then somebody developing the other side developing the next iteration. That's in a void where, and I know this would have been discussed on previous podcasts with you, that's in a void where there is control of the air hasn't been won. And really, I think the Air Force, certainly Royal Air Force, and the government, the defence, doesn't really want to get into that position. The aim is that we have a strong enough Air Force, along with our NATO allies, that we either deter that completely or we are able to get ahead of the game, and at least constrain sort of limited control of the air where we need to, in order to negate that happening.
So just going back to the Battle of Britain in 1940 and the picture, the relationship between not just the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, but even within the Royal Air Force, there wasn't coherence necessarily. People were not agreeing. And as far as communication between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force, what was going on, and the Army Air Defence Systems, how does that compare to this era of one defence that we are in now?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question. As you allude to, in 1940, even different wings of the Royal Air Force were in disagreement about how to fight, how to tackle the incoming raids from the Luftwaffe, from the Nazis. In today's services in defence, generally, the emphasis is very much on the integration of the different domains. We include, of course, now space and cyber, the coordination of them through strategic command, through a permanent joint headquarters at Northwood, and similarly in NATO, the doctrine and the ways of thinking about integration, and even where perhaps things can't be integrated, they need to be interoperable and or interchangeable. So there's a lot of going on there, but I think at the heart of it is that there is this sense of one defence force working together. And I absolutely must emphasise, in my opinion, that though it's very important that the Royal Air Force, Royal Navy, Space Command, Army and so on are integrated and as best as possible, it's probably as if not more important that we're able to do that at the drop of a hat with Estonia or Poland, that the RAF is able to operate with the Polish army or the Estonian army, whereas the British army is able to operate with a French air cover, because we're not going to fight. Let's hope we never do, but if we have to, we're not going to fight as a sort of British contribution, a sort of convoy of Brits. We'll be working with different nations within NATO. So
I guess
that integrated bit is very important to me as well.
To be fair, if you look back at 1940 and the squadrons that fought in the Battle of Britain, we had Polish squadrons. We had American aircrew. We had aircrew from throughout the Commonwealth. We had French aircrew. So, yeah, interesting.
No, absolutely. And I mean, just to sort of cut back to the Battle of Britain, we need to remember as well that we were we could not have, as the Britain, have succeeded in the Battle of Britain without all the resources and supplies coming from other countries, particularly the US across the Atlantic, that kept us going with fuel and all the other things necessary to fight a war. So, the integration below this kind of melding of armed forces that are able to work, communicate, make decisions, prosecute targets, so on and so forth. It's all the other activity that goes in support of that, and much of that, of course, for us now, much more so than perhaps decades before, is within industry because of the civilianization and contractorization of a lot of our military activity.
That's a really good way to move into the next point, which is about the National Defence Plan. And we'd really like to know from what is out there in the public domain, what is society doing to prepare, cross government, to deter or prepare for a potential next Battle of Britain?
Well, the jury is out a little at the moment, and we are, of course, at the time that we're talking, waiting for the outcome of the Strategic Defence Review. So we will see what is in that. I suppose from my perspective, and the perspective of people who I talk to a fair bit in the academic and sort of supporters of defence space, if you like, is we're probably not well prepared, really, particularly compared to some of our allies. We are the only NATO nation at the moment that doesn't have a national defence plan. Now, there is work ongoing looking into that, and I think, again, something I hope might come out of the Strategic Defence Review, because essentially what we're talking about is what are our parts of our, what are the targets that we would consider critical national infrastructure. There's the defence of the population as well, but we won't be able to fight effectively if we are vulnerable in certain areas. Now, the discussion on exactly what consists CNI is, of course, classified, and I'm not privy to the exact details, but we see what's happening in Ukraine, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist, which I'm not, so that's okay then, to know it'll be military installations, military airfields, energy nodes, nuclear power stations, transport nodes. We've seen those targeted in Ukraine. We've seen particularly energy and how important that is. Those are areas where we probably need to most concentrate on protecting. But there's something else to resilience, and this sort of comes to your wider question, is how much societies really would be prepared. I mean, you look at the Battle of the Loo Rolls at the beginning of COVID, we didn't do too well in preparing for something that was nothing like warfare in this country. Also, there was the all-nation message alerts. We'll remember the text messages on mobiles that most people got, but some people didn't, which was all very controversial. But my understanding is that, and this was the last government, that ministerial sign-off took quite a long time because there was so much nervousness about worrying the population. I'm not criticising the government for that, by the way. I can see exactly why ministers are worried that what do we want to scaremonger. But you contrast that with someone like Sweden, which has, put out its in case of crisis or war booklet in November 2024. And this is not new. Sweden's been talking about total defence for some time, where they have backup plans for secondary roles for school buildings and shelters and so on and so forth. And in fact, I heard only this week that France is planning to produce a similar document for its population in the summer. We're not, as far as I know, doing that in this country. So I think in terms of resilience and national defence, there is a lot to be done. And I'm keen that we talk about it without scaremongering, but being realistic with the population, that this is a possibility. And I think this comes to the core of the point of the podcast. The work it goes on all the time within the forces and within the Royal Air Force specifically to change operational mindset. But that can't really happen properly unless society is brought along too.
Okay. So, we were in an air force. I'm in an air force where we're used to expeditionary operations. That giant ship is turning, and we're gearing up and we're getting better. What from a former service person? What is your advice for Royal Air Force commanders to engender a war-fighting mindset as we look at Britain as being potentially the place where the next battle could be?
I think it's really challenging for RAF commanders because they sit within an ecosystem bigger than them, and I'll maybe illustrate that in a couple of ways. But I'll start. You talked about the fact that that my experience was the era of expeditionary operations, and that was literally where you were sent on deployment, you picked up your kit, off you went, 4 months, 6 months, a year, depending, and then you came back and you gave your kit back and you put your blues on again. If you were in a non-flying role, for example. And home base was completely safe. I mean, it wasn't safe from terrorist attacks potentially and other things, but it wasn't somewhere you felt that you'd be fighting from. Now, the fly and fight ethos that Chief of the Air Staff talks about is obviously partly about tackling that. When I say I think it's hard for RAF commanders, and this is again a bit about my work about risk appetite, I think the difficulty comes in that on the one hand, you can, as a commander, talk about all the issues that we've talked about today, or succinctly summarize them in a much better way than I am, to your personnel, in order for them to understand the threat, their place in countering the threat, deterring that threat, and so on and so forth. You're busy telling people that on the one hand, but on the other hand, as has been widely acknowledged, not least in the Haythornthwaite Review and to Armed Forces Incentivization, there's too much process and too much bureaucracy in just the day-to-day life of service personnel. And just to give a slightly flippant example, but it's real, claiming for a coffee, or as happened to me recently, claiming for some biscuits at a conference, which had to be cleared at a very senior level because of the kind of processes that have been set up. RAF commanders can't tackle that, but so that it needs the help of and will of ministers. And I've heard Minister for the Armed Forces talk about this, specifically understanding the problem. I know he does, but that's where I think it's really difficult. If you're trying to get a force on the one hand to sort of think, might have to fight tomorrow, I need this mindset, it might be my own base that's at attack, I might be dispersing, with hardly any notice. On the other hand, it takes me, forever to get approval for a travel claim. And you can't ask people to be in both mindsets, I don't believe, at the same time. And so there's something there. It's being tackled. People know it's an issue. But I think for RAF commanders, it does make it quite difficult.
Yeah. Do you know what, Sophie? That is not a new problem. A while ago, I remember reading a book about a Royal Air Force pilot, Second World War, sent off to, I think he was fighting in Burma, and the admin was chasing him for some really minor nauseating deal, and he's flying every day, fighting every day, and some really annoying admin is chasing him, which was not welcome in his world. So yeah, that does go on. Is there anything? So you've got the admin side of thing, but what about the spirit of the warfighter?
Well, I think, it's when I've looked back at the Cold War sort of culture and mentality, and I'm one of these people that doesn't believe we just sort of recreate Cold War mentality and it'll all be fine, because it's a different thing. It's different technologies, different ways of fighting. The integration piece, as you mentioned, I mean, yes, integration was important in the Cold War, but I think we're in a different place, and particularly with the more complex domain set that we have. But I do think, the exercising, that's quite an important element of it. Actually getting back to that really regular drumbeat of exercising, of being called to readiness, those kind of things. Now, it's not, I'm not particularly close to exactly who's doing what on Air Force bases at the moment, but I sit here talking to you from Salisbury, where we had the Novichok attack in 2018, and you just the disruption that was created by that first attack. If I just look at March, even the threat of that, or the claim that has happened at the gates of one of our airfields, there's a lot of preparation and exercising that can be done to make sure that everybody is fully prepared and in that mindset. And I suppose that's what I think is really important. But beyond that, I do think the leadership is doing a good job of constantly talking about this important aspect. I mean, Kaz has made it one of his 3 priorities, right? The operational mindset. So I'm admiring of the efforts and the understanding, and actually the change. Let's say that since 2022 and the reinvasion of Ukraine by Russia, I have seen such a change in rhetoric, prioritization, and so on and so forth. So I think there's movement in definitely the right direction. But going back to my earlier point, I still think in a society where others are unaware, it's quite difficult. And if I might make one further point, that it reminds me of some of the experiences that were recounted to me by the Reaper Force when it set up in Waddington, when we didn't talk an awful lot about Reaper because there was the Ministry of Defence was not saying a whole lot about its activities, and I remember that from my days in the Ministry of Defence. But there were people that were working on the Reaper Squadron and other people on the base that didn't really know much about it. And their encounters were quite difficult because actually when you're flying and fighting, as they actually were, but then you're going down to the spa or whatever it is at Waddington, and there's other people in the queue sort of getting worked up about minor things, absolutely fine and well within their rights. That's a really difficult tension. And I heard that from people on the Reaper Force. And actually, if you, in a much bigger way, I think that's the challenge for the Air Force. In a society that's going around moaning about potholes, no offence to society or anybody for moaning about potholes, but it is hard to inculcate an operational mindset within the wire and then everybody go about their regular business the rest of the time. So I think it's one of those challenges that will never be completely sorted unless, sadly, the real thing happens. That's my kind of word of understanding, if you like, to the service commanders for that.
It's interesting to reflect. When you and I both joined the Air Force, we had Strike Command and Support Command.
Yep.
And Strike Command was the tip of the spear. It was the very, that was the war fighting part of the Royal Air Force. And Support Command did exactly what it was supposed to do. It supported the war fighters. We don't have that anymore. We just have Air Command. But I guess it's worth knowing that Air Command is located at the original home of Strike Command, and maybe we should all be in that warfighter spirit because we just have one command.
Yeah, and I think going back to the conversation we were having about all the different elements, both in the First World War and Second World War, that came together to become part of that air defence system. What now we're referring to as an integrated air and missile defence system, but essentially it's those support parts. It's that you mentioned photo reconnaissance, intelligence, the cyber support, the cyber specialists that work in the Air Force and in support of the Air Force, people at GCHQ, or different part of those. Some of them are clearly not in uniform. Civilians, civil servants, contractors, all of them are part of that picture. I mean, the whole force concept is that as well. Perhaps the Cold War in particular was it was just easier to do it like that, and there were people that were forward in RAF Germany and some that felt further from the front line. I don't know. That's probably something to explore in another discussion. But yes, I am pleased that the modern Air Force doesn't see that distinction.
Sophie, to bring this to a conclusion, and we really appreciate what you've told us so far, but just to finish on, why does this topic mean so much to you, the next Battle of Britain?
Because it really matters. It's really important. It's a difficult subject to discuss because it involves acronyms like IAMD. It's quite complicated in terms of talking about, say, if you're talking doctrinally offensive and defensive counter-air, what does that mean to a layperson after all? But actually, this is a core part of our deterrence. We have excellent capabilities within this country to produce the kind of technology, the capabilities that we would need to bolster our air and missile defence. And when we look across NATO nations see that, and some of them are significantly more on the front foot. Poland would be a good example. And when we see NATO at the Washington Summit in July of 2024 massively committing to the importance of air and missile defence. But you know what? The deals, we've been doing those deals with Poland for our industry to supply that capability to Poland because we have it in this country, shown most recently by the announcement that we will be providing air defence missiles to Ukraine, built by Thales in Northern Ireland. So I think getting the message across that we have the capability to improve the way that we're defended, even as importantly, we can do that as part of what the Chancellor called becoming a defence industrial superpower. Might not like the phrase itself, but the intent of improving our defence industry to grow jobs is admirable. And at the end of the day, if we have decent air and missile defence, if we have the credible defence that puts off our enemies, then that's what's most important, because war is a failure. That is a failure of deterrence. So what we are trying to do by creating decent defences and spending more on defence is stopping war. That's the most important thing to me.
Dr Sophy Antrobus, thank you for your insight. Thank you for being on Inside Air.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
With a look back at some recent news stories from the RAF, this is Reheat for Inside Air. The RAF has been certified as fit to fly and undertake NATO air policing at a ceremony in Poland. Typhoons from 2 Army Cooperation Squadron from RAF Lossiemouth are deployed to the 22nd Air Base, where they're augmented by a detachment of Swedish Gripen fighter jets. This is the first time that Swedish combat aircraft will take part in air policing from the territory of another ally. It's also the first time that Swedish combat aircraft will take part in NATO's enhanced air policing under the command of NATO since their accession to the organisation in 2024. Operation High Mast will see the RAF conduct exercises with worldwide allies from on board HMS Prince of Wales, the lead of the UK Carrier Strike Group. The sophisticated capabilities of the F-35B Lightning will be prominently on display during this deployment. Its ability to operate in any location on land or at sea allows for a diverse range of multi-role missions, including air-to-surface strikes, electronic warfare, intelligence gathering and air-to-air operations. This deployment, characterised by the presence of world-class vessels alongside fifth-generation aircraft, marks a unique opportunity to train and develop military interoperability. Meanwhile, further training is taking place in the UK in the form of Exercise Ramstein Flag. Hosted by the Royal Netherlands Air Force, this exercise involves over 90 aircraft operating from 12 Allied air bases, supported by over 15 nations. RAF Marham welcomed 6 F-18 Hornet aircraft from the Spanish Air Force, while in Scotland, RAF Lossiemouth-based Typhoon aircraft have practiced air-to-air refuelling alongside partner nations. Exercise Ramstein Flag demonstrates the UK's strength, readiness and commitment to our allies. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
I'm Flight Sergeant Katrina Harris.
What's your profession?
So I'm based at the OTC at RAF Leeming. We're part of 11 Group, we're a lodger unit, and I'm the SME for air and space operations.
What's the best thing about your job?
It's working with NATO. So I haven't done a lot with NATO previously, and it's been quite a steep learning curve since joining the OTC. I went out for a scheduling conference in September and it was fabulous. I learned so much and met so many NAT reps. It's really quite eye-opening.
Hardest part of your job?
It's the worst and the best. It's travel away from home. So it's great to go places and do bits and pieces, but sometimes you're leaving the family behind and sometimes that can be a bit of a strain, but it's good. I enjoy it.
Best location you've served?
I would definitely say at Krateri in Cyprus. I was there 2 years and it was an accompanied tour, so I was there with my family and we worked hard, but when we weren't working, it was like being on a holiday. It was absolutely fabulous, just exploring the island.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
It's 2 things. It is Yorkshire tea bags and Marmite, which I know is, it splits opinion. You either love it or hate it, but I absolutely love it.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
It was meeting the Queen, the previous monarch. Yeah, I was at Marham and she was the honorary Air Commodore at the time, and it was just speaking to her and meeting her was definitely my proudest moment.
Thank you, Flight Sergeant Harris, for being the latest aviator to take part in Under the Hat.
that's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.